To the modern age, the Victorian era is an attractive mystery. Attractive because we envy the well-off Victorian his sense of complete security. A mystery because no matter how hard we try, we can never quite get under the skin of the Victorians. We can read their memoirs or study their letters, we can stare at their portraits, we can even, in a few cases, hear their actual voices filtered through the primitive technology of the science of recording. One day in 1888, Arthur Sullivan paid a visit to his friend Colonel Gouraud in south-east London. And there, in the Colonel's house, Sullivan flung out the longest surviving message of all from the primitive invention of Mr. Edison.
Now listen to the voice of Sir Arthur Sullivan. For myself, I can only say that I am astonished and somewhat terrified at the result of this evening's experiment. Astonished at the wonderful power you have developed, and terrified at the thought that so much hideous and bad music may be put on record forever. Arthur Sullivan.
So Sullivan must have been among the very first artists to suspect the importance of the recording of the human voice. It's fascinating to hear that same voice that Gilbert must have heard so many thousands of times when they were working together. But not even the sound of the voice can really penetrate the mystery for us. One of the greatest of all difficulties in coming to grips with the Gilbert and Sullivan era is to try to see, through the eyes of men like them, the two great complicators, sex and death. Regarding death, when Sullivan wrote The Lost Chord, how convinced was he by the heaven and the afterlife that he so powerfully set to music? And what of his other great religious hit song? To what extent was his life and conduct governed by the ideas suggested by this? Before a frankly agnostic world smiles about onward Christian soldiers, I think we should pause long enough to savour the irony that it was this kind of evangelising and not the Savoy operas that turned Sullivan into Sir Arthur. Do you think there was any friction, at least on the surface, between the very contrasted attitudes between Gilbert and Sullivan on the question of rulers and despots? Because he refers to the Tsar, I think, in the Recipe for a Heavy Dragoon. And during the writing of Iolanthe, Sullivan is actually on holiday with the Tsar. And so Gilbert is poking fun at Sullivan's friends, in a sense, because Sullivan moves in society and Gilbert mocks it. Sullivan must have been very uncomfortable by some of the things that Gilbert presented him with to set to music.
I suppose he must have been. Sullivan himself, of course, was not of royal blood, but all of his friends were. He could really essentially call on the royal family anytime he wanted, and they invited him out to shoot and hunt and all the things that went on in the great century. One can't help but wonder how he felt when he wrote these operettas in which class distinction would be parodied, and yet, for example, in the Gondoliers, where they talk about a right down wonderful queen, Queen Victoria read the score and asked that a command performance be done. And Jessie Bond, who was one of the lead singers in that day, writes in her memoirs how nervous she was going up to Balmoral Castle, knowing that she would have to sing this song. Wouldn't it be a lovely thing to be a regular queen, right in front of Queen Victoria? She'd only be about 15 feet away. Jessie Bond tells a great story about when she was up there, she accidentally found herself in the throne room, went up and sat on the throne. Because to actors, I guess nothing's sacred.
One of us to be a queen, sit on a golden throne, with a beautiful robe of golden green. I've always understood. I wonder whether she'd wear a feather. I rather think she should.
Oh, 'tis honest thing I mean to be a regular royal queen. No half and half affair, I mean no half and half affair. Right on regular royal queen.
She'll drive about in a carriage and pair with the king on her left-hand side, and a milk white horse is a matter of course whenever she wants to ride, with beautiful silver shoes to wear upon her dainty feet, with endless stocks of beautiful frocks, and as much as she wants to eat.
Oh, 'tis a glorious thing I mean to be a regular royal queen. No half and half affair, I mean no half and half affair. But a right down regular royal queen.
Whenever she condescends to walk, be sure she'll shine at that, with a haughty stare and a nose in the air like a well-born aristocrat. At elegant high society talk, she'll bear away the veil, with a how do you do, and a how are you, and I trust I see you well.
Oh, 'tis glorious thing I mean to be a regular royal queen. No half and half affair, I mean no half and half affair. But right down regular royal queen. And noble lords will scrape and bow and double themselves in two, and open their eyes in blank surprise at whatever she likes to do. And everybody will roundly vow she's fair as flowers in May, and say, how clever, at whatsoever she condescends to say. Oh, 'tis glorious thing I mean to be a regular royal queen. No half and half affair, I mean no half and half affair. But like a regular royal queen. Oh, 'tis a glorious thing I mean to be a regular royal queen. A right on regular royal queen.
Sullivan, again, was really acquainted with the family, and when Prince of Wales became ill and then recovered, Sullivan wrote a Te Deum and dedicated it to him. When he was knighted, the Queen remarked to him, wouldn't it be lovely if you could write a grand opera? And she did so on more than one occasion. So Sullivan proceeded to write the grand opera, which the good Queen never saw.
She never bothered to go after having requested him to compose it?
No. He sent her the score autographed, and she thanked him for it, and then she asked if she could see the gondoliers.
How interesting that she asked for a grand opera and prefers the gondoliers. That's a very telling comment on the whole story in a way.
A lot of people feel, too, that the gondoliers was a sop to Sullivan, that Gilbert wrote it and purposely made the words less important. As you know, about 15 to 20 minutes of the first of it is nothing but music. There's no dialogue. And a lot of the music in it involves the singer singing la, 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 and not very much in the way of important words. In fact, some of it's in Italian. And Gilbert, at least his thought, did that so that Sullivan could write the music and just, here you are, Sullivan. The other thought that is commonly advanced about this operetta was that Gilbert was beginning to have trouble, as was D'Oyly Carte, with the various people. George Grossmith, for example, wanted to drift off and go out on his own, not unlike here in Hollywood when a star is created and initially the star works at a very reasonable price but then becomes very unreasonable, wants a dressing room with hot water, things of that sort. In writing The Gondoliers, he essentially cast two of just about everything. So the heroes are really two heroes. The parts are more divided up, although we see the same repertoire of Gilbert characters. It is a very musical operetta, and the songs everyone can hum and sing. The plot structure is very weak.
There lived a king, as I've been told, in the wonder-working days of old, when hearts were twice as good as gold, and 20 times as men old. Whose temple triumphed in his face and in his had Rhenish wine to drink. It made him very sad to think that some drunkard or a jink must be content with toddy. With toddy, must be content with toddy. He wished all men as rich as he, and he was rich as rich could be. So to the top of every tree promoted everybody. Now that's the kind of king for me. He wished all men as rich as he. So to the top of every tree promoted everybody. Lord Chancellors were chief as sprats, and bishops in their shovel hats were plentiful as tabby cats. In point of fact, too many. Ambassadors crop like hay, prime ministers and such as they grew like asparagus in May, and dukes were 3 a penny. On every side field marshals did, small beer were lords lieutenant did, with happy wealthy ocean teamed all round his wide dominion. His banners on his wide dominions, and party leaders you might meet in 2s and 3s in every street, maintaining with no little heat their various opinion. Now that's a sight you couldn't meet, 2 party leaders in each street, maintaining with no little heat their various opinions. That king, although no one denies, his heart was of abnormal size, yet he'd have acted otherwise if he had been a cucumber. The end is easily foretold when every blessed thing you hold is made of silver or of gold. You long for simple pewter when you have nothing else to wear but cloth of gold and satin red. For cloth of gold you cease to care, of gold's the price of shoddy, of shoddy, of gold's the price of shoddy. In short, whoever you may be, to this conclusion you'll agree, when everyone is somebody, then no one's anybody. Now that's as plain can be. To this conclusion we agree, when everyone is somebody, then no one's anybody.
One of the most extraordinary facts about the whole Gilbert and Sullivan thing, to me, it seems uncharacteristic of Gilbert, is his refusal or inability or disinclination, whatever you like to call it, to be present at a first night. And this curious convention by which he would walk the embankment and time his return to the theatre just in time to receive a standing ovation or whatever it was. Does this sound to you, Tom, like something that was in character with Gilbert? I would have thought he was so fearless. Maybe fearless is not the right word. Perhaps he wasn't frightened when he walked the embankment. It just seemed to be an extraordinary thing for him to have done.
Well, he hated opening nights, and he said that in his letters, and he would become very nervous. There are records, for example, of him going on the stage and making the characters very nervous, telling them, pull in your chin, sit up straight, be sure and sing in a loud voice, be sure when you sing this song that it's just right. And again, quoting Jessie Bond in her biography, she tells about how playing Phoebe at the spinning wheel in the opening of Yeoman of the Guard, the play opens with her alone on the stage, and there was Gilbert out there, and the overture's winding down, and the people are all in the house, and it's the first night, and he's out there telling her how to play this part. And she, as an artist, is trying to compose herself and get to feel like the part she's supposed to play, and she finally had to say, you've got to get out of here so I can do this. Gilbert would leave the theater. There are several records of him spending time in the green room where the actors would congregate drinking coffee, but he did not sit in the houses. He waited till the show was over and then he would appear and hopefully listen for the cheers. There's also a lot made about the reunions later in his life. The last time he and Sullivan were to appear on stage together was at the revival of The Sorcerer in the 1890s. The two men were so estranged at that point that they didn't acknowledge each other. They came out and took a bow from different parts of the theater.
The Gondoliers is a riot of Gilbertian irreverence. Even by Gilbertian standards, there's hardly an institution left standing by the fall of the curtain. And among Gilbert's targets was one of the most sacred of all Victorian sacred cows, the British Army. Now, it so happens that this was a subject on which Gilbert considered himself an expert, having gone down in history as the only militia officer ever known to make his mess bill a subject of national concern. At the time, he was a captain in the Royal Aberdeen Militia, and his behaviour reminds us of the Duke of Wellington's confession regarding the English soldier. I don't know if he frightens the enemy, but by God, he terrifies me. The bone of contention was this mess bill of Gilbert's.
July the 25th, 1876. To the President of the Mess Committee. I must decline to pay for more messing than can be applied to the food placed before me. There is an item of £1, 3 shillings and 9pence for beer. I never touch beer. Possibly this may include spirits. I certainly did not drink 50 glasses of brandy during the 12 days I was with the regiment.
The Colonel's response was to say that messing arrangements had nothing to do with Gilbert. And nobody had told the poor fellow that everything had something to do with Gilbert, who replied by return of post.
I must decline, after this expression of opinion, to serve under an officer who is so little qualified to command gentlemen. I propose to resign my commission.
And it was only on the intercession of the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army himself that Gilbert was prevailed upon to stay with the colours. The Commander-in-Chief was the notorious Duke of Cambridge, whose experience of battle conditions has been defined, rather charitably I think, as limited.
Enterprise of martial kind, when there was any fighting, he led his regiment from behind, he found it less exciting. But when away his regiment ran, his place was at the foro, that celebrated, cultivated, underrated nobleman, the Duke of Toro.
In the first and foremost line, you always sprung at night, that celebrated, cultivated, underrated nobleman, the Duke of Toro.
When to evade destruction's hand, to hide they all proceeded. No soldier in that gallant band hit half as well as he did. He lay concealed throughout the war, and so preserved his gore. Oh, that unaffected, undetected, well-connected warrior, the Duke of Toro.
In he always shook the lead, that unaffected, undetected, well-connected warrior, the Duke of Toro.
When told that they would all be shot unless they left the service, that hero hesitated not, so marvelous his service. He sent his resignation in the first of all his coro, that very knowing, overflowing, easygoing paladin, the Duke of Toro.
To men of gross acclaim, he always showed the way, that very knowing, overflowing, easygoing paladin, the Duke of Toro. That very knowing, overflowing, easygoing paladin, the Duke of Toro.
Gilbert was perfectly at home playing robust soldier games with the militia, but anything in that line would have been out of the question for Sullivan. For most of his adult life, he was either in pain or painfully worried about when he was next likely to be in pain. Indeed, the history of the Savoy operas sometimes sounds like a chronicle of the trials and tribulations of a permanent invalid.
Sullivan had kidney problems all through his life. He had what we would call today nephritis and obstructive kidney disease with stones. In those days, there was not the capability of giving him a general anesthetic, so one would have to stick an instrument up inside him while he was awake and crush the stones. In the latter part of his life, Sullivan was uremic, meaning he had poisons that couldn't be cleared from his body. And it's extraordinary that the more suffering this man sustained, the more beautiful the music came out of him. Some people have said that if he had been more healthy, he might not have written anything because he'd be out partying all the time. It was his illness that sort of kept him to his house and made him realize his mortality and made him strive to write all these things. He had just absolute disasters in his life. On the opening night of Iolanthe, he'd had a big bank failure and lost all of his savings, and there he was out conducting. On many of the opening nights, he could barely get there to conduct because of the pain that he had. He, again, had this lifelong friendship with Mrs. Ronalds, even though he got mixed up with several other gals. He went out one morning in 1900 to visit his mother's grave and caught pneumonia. There had been several previous alerts that Sullivan was dying. 5 years earlier, the public had been informed that Mr. Sullivan's gravely ill and might pass away. And so another alert went out, and Mrs. Ronalds hurried back to London, but arrived too late. He had passed away.
The business of visiting his mother's grave underlines the great family affection and loyalty that the Sullivans had. They sound like a very close-knit family.
There's a contrast between Gilbert and Sullivan.
Again,
Gilbert,
yes.
sort of estranged, especially from his mother, who evidently was a very cold, not very friendly type. It's said that in the Gilbert household that Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert, I'm talking about Gilbert's parents, dressed themselves formally and didn't really stay together or sleep together or have much contact. And Gilbert was their only son, and they observed all the formalities, but there was no warmth or love, in contrast to the Sullivan family, which there was a great deal of love and affection. He had a brother. There were always lots of children around. Their backgrounds couldn't be more dissimilar.
And yet the irony is, of course, that Gilbert married, we presume happily, and Sullivan never did. I suppose if Mrs. Ronalds hadn't have been already married, perhaps Sullivan and she would have married.
I think they would have. Divorce is out of the question in those days.
What about Gilbert's marriage? We understand that it was a happy one, because happy is the marriage with no history. You don't hear much about it afterwards. That was a congenial arrangement for both of them. She seems to have been a tactful, affectionate solicitor's wife for him.
In the letters that survive that she wrote to him, she was always very caring. He would be a difficult person to care about. And I think she was willing to accept this role and become the wife of this very irascible person. And she had a quality that she could calm him down and meet his needs. And I think they had a very good marriage.
It would appear so, yes.
I think both of them, in their personal lives, were fairly happy. We look today upon people that live alone and say how unhappy or lonely they must be. I don't think Sullivan was lonely at all. He always had somebody visiting him, or he was visiting somebody else. You've alluded to the Tsar. He was forever going on trips, belonging to clubs. He did not want for companionship of people that really cared about him.
I read somewhere that when Whistler sued Ruskin for libel, on the first morning of the trial, Gilbert had breakfast with him. That really seemed to me to be the one breakfast I'd like to have been present at, because two of the most vitriolic wits of the 19th century, and also the two most litigious men, I mean, between them, Whistler and Gilbert, either sued or threatened to sue everybody. And I'd love to have heard what they had to say.
I would have loved to have been there, too. Yes, this breakfast is well recorded, and Gilbert was in the courtroom watching this trial.
Was he indeed?
Yes, for part of it.
I wonder where Gilbert's sympathies would have lain, because I would have thought, really, he would have sympathised with Whistler at the expense of an unfair criticism, and yet, in patience, he seems to be lining up with the Philistines, because he's laughing at anybody that takes art seriously. It's a very ambivalent stance. It's almost as though he doesn't want any art to be taken too seriously, and yet I feel he would have been on Whistler's side in the thing against Ruskin.
I think he might well have been. We are always at our peril when we look at a plot structure in one of these operettas and impute that these are necessarily Gilbert's true motivations or feelings. I think these two men were writing commercially. I don't think they were writing for posterity. I think they were writing for the time, and they were trying to write things that would sell. Certainly they were poking barbs at things that were all around them, and nothing was sacred to them.
If you're anxious for to shine in the high aesthetic line as a man of culture rare, you must get aboard the germs of the transcendental terms and plant them everywhere. You must lie upon the daisies and discourse in novel phrases of your complicated state of mind. The meaning doesn't matter if it's only idle chatter of the transcendental kind. And everyone will say, as you walk your mystic way, if this young man expresses himself in terms too deep for me, why, what a very singularly deep young man, this deep young man must be. Be eloquent in praise of the very dull old days which have long since passed away, and convince them, if you can, that the reign of good Queen Anne was culture's palmiest day. Of course you will poo-poo whatever may be fresh and new, and declare it's crude and mean, for stop short in the cultivated cause of the Empress Josephine. And everyone will say, as you walk your mystic way, if that's not good enough for him, which is good enough for me, why what a very cultivated kind of youth this kind of youth must be. Then a sentimental passion of a vegetable fashion must excite your languid spleen, and attachment a la Plato for a bashful young potato, or a not too French bean. Though the Philistines may jostle, you would rank as an apostle in the high aesthetic band, if you walked on Piccadilly with a poppy or a lily in your medieval hand. And everyone will say, as you walk your flowery way, if he's content with a vegetable love, which would certainly not suit me, why what a most particularly pure young man this pure young man must be.
Now, in Patience, the Wildean figure of Bunthorne is made to look absurd and ridiculous, and later on Wilde very clearly derives some of his effects from Gilbert. There seems to me to be a bit of asperity there, and it brings me to this extraordinary point which you may be able to bring some light on, because I came across a book, I think it's called The Erotic in Art, and it's written by an American, and he appears to have ransacked the British Museum, the section where the proscribed material is, and he talks of the existence of a brief opera called the Sod's Opera, which Gilbert wrote as a joke sometime, I think, after the Oscar Wilde trial and before Wilde's death. Now, Osbert Sitwell, I believe, has said that he once saw a copy of it. It's never come to light. The story has not been substantiated. Do you think Gilbert was the sort of man capable of writing a scurrilous or schoolboy lampoon of that style?
Well, I've seen what is referred to as the Sod's Opera. I have a copy of it. The problem with it is whether it is authentic or not. The copy I have is typewritten, but accompanying it I have a single page in Gilbert's handwriting of part of it, a central part of it, not the beginning nor the end. By today's standard, it's not what you would call filthy or scurrilous, but by Victorian standards, and certainly by the standards of the time and the operettas, it is a departure, and it does him no credit. That Gilbert had a sexual nature, or at least had feelings that he wished to write down that might not play, say, in Boston, doesn't come as a surprise to anyone that studies Sigmund Freud. We all have these feelings. And I don't think it lessens his contribution or what he did that he would write something that maybe is scatologic.
Oh, on the contrary, in my mind, it would enhance his reputation because it showed him as a man with a very healthy sense of humour and a man who obviously wasn't solemn all the time. Wonderful.
It's hard to date it. I can't really date that it occurred as an offshoot of the Wilde Ruskin affair.
No, I wasn't thinking of the Wilde Ruskin affair. I was thinking of Oscar's trial for homosexual offences.
Yes. It deals with homosexuality.
Is it not extraordinary, then, that in 80 years it's never really been substantiated or come to light? Is there been a conspiracy to conceal it, do you think?
I think there's a great deal about these two men that has been maybe not a conspiracy, but has certainly been left out. It was the Victorian ethic to leave your personal life out. It's only in the modern era that we want to look behind the scenes and see what these people do at night or where they go and what they...
But we've been very successful in finding out about the others. We've produced more clay feet than you could get into a museum in the last 8 years, but not Gilbert and Sullivan.
There's a whole literature on Sullivan, or not a whole literature, there's at least several articles and books that he's a homosexual.
Sullivan?
Sullivan's a homosexual. And I, frankly, from reading his letters and all, don't believe this for a second. The fact that he never married, that he lived alone with a parrot. I have a parrot. Parrot could sing Little Buttercup. But the fact remains that he had at least 3 major romances, probably 4, And the last romance was kind of embarrassing. After his death, his heirs thought that the last romance was so embarrassing that they destroyed most of his letters. And we only know about it because the woman in question saved a few of the letters he wrote to her.
Who was this woman?
One Violet X.
Violet X?
Violet X. I've seen some of the transcriptions of the letters, which claimed by one fellow are genuine. They just reveal an old man very interested in a girl of 20 and proposing marriage to her repeatedly, promising her money, saying that he would only live for a few more years. Please marry me.
Well, that sounds exactly like Dickens with Ellen Ternan. Dickens 52, Ternan
Yes,
18.
yes.
So I don't think that that's ridiculous. It may be tragic, but it's...
But it was felt by the remnants of Sullivan's family, which oddly enough live here in Los Angeles, to be sufficiently damning that this should be destroyed. And in fact, they don't wish to be identified. And part of my meeting one of the key descendants was that I never disclosed her address to any of the Gilbert and Sullivan aficionados because she didn't want to be pestered. Recently, this lady has died, and she had considerable material of Sullivan. Sullivan's estate, for example, was probated here in Los Angeles. After the success of the Mikado, Sullivan came here, and it was a very arduous trip. He had to journey part of the way by stagecoach and by the very primitive rail. There's a record of him stopping in Salt Lake City and playing the organ there in the tabernacle at the Mormon temple. He traveled to San Francisco, was entertained by the clubs there, was a great celebrity wherever he traveled, and there's many interviews with him here in the Los Angeles papers. And it's funny reading those interviews because he always says, well, I'm thinking of settling down here. It's extraordinary to think of a man from London in 1885 thinking about settling down in sleepy little Los Angeles, a town of 100,000 people or so.
It may be that death's bright angel will speak in that chord again. It may be that all in heaven I shall hear that grand amen. It may be that death's bright angel will speak in that chord again. It may be that all in heaven I shall hear that grand
The circumstances of Sullivan's death and Gilbert's reaction to it sound to me like one of the more improbable plot devices in one of their more improbable operas. In November 1900, just as the 19th century was approaching its last few days, Sullivan lay dying, and his partner planned to visit him. But this was the time when Gilbert, living at his grand estate at Harrow Weald, was digging himself a lake, and in digging it gave himself rheumatic fever, which prevented him visiting his dying collaborator. Now, as it turned out, in digging the lake, Gilbert was in effect digging his own grave. 11 years after Sullivan had died, Gilbert was playing host to two young and conventionally demure young maidens.
They were house guests for the day, and they later gave statements that there was no hanky-panky. Now, today, of course, dying under mysterious circumstances with a couple of young ladies would be viewed with great suspicion. The initial newspaper report said he drowned, but examination of his body showed that he'd had a heart attack. He was in his 70s.
Are you implying that there was something suspicious about...
No, not at all. I think the lady actually did get in trouble in the pond. It's a deep pond if you go out there. It's a lake. And you could envision somebody perhaps swimming out over their head in baggy clothing and having trouble. And Gilbert was a romantic, so he would jump in and try to save you. When he died, there was a play on the boards called The Hooligan. It's interesting because the main character in The Hooligan, who's in a jail cell awaiting execution, is terrified. The last line is, dead, heart failure. And Gilbert had written this just shortly before he was to suffer the same fate.
The Times, May the 30th, 1911. We record with much regret that Sir William Schwenk Gilbert, the poet and dramatic author, died suddenly yesterday afternoon of a heart affection while bathing at his home at Harrow Weald. On arrival at his residence, he had stated his intention to bathe...
And so, 40 years after the first night of Thespis, the works of Gilbert and Sullivan became what they have been ever since, and always will be, posthumous, leaving posterity to do what it can to decide what manner of partners they were, and what manner of works they thought they'd written. In a way, the Gilbert and Sullivan story comes full circle with the fact that a century after Sullivan's toying with the idea of going west, it should be America which takes up the Gilbert and Sullivan operas and breathes new commercial life into them. Purists might balk at the liberties taken with the text, especially with Sullivan's orchestration, but nobody among the originals would have found anything but joy in the vast profits which accrued to the revival. Sullivan would have smiled and bought somebody another diamond necklace. Gilbert would have grunted irascible satisfaction and insisted he didn't understand orchestration anyway. As for Carte, were he here to witness the Savoyard bonanza, he would have been jumping up and down in frustration at the thought it wasn't him who was coining it.
For today our pirate prentice rises from indentures free. Strong his arm and keen his senses, he's a pirate now indeed. Here's the Dr. Prentice, out of his adventures. 22 now he's rising, and alone he's fit to fly, which we're bent on signalizing with unusual revelry. Here's the Dr. Prentice, out of his adventures. For the pirates, till fill the pirate laugh, and to make us more than merry, and the pirate of the
And with that extract from Joseph Papp's recent version of The Pirates of Penzance, we end this series. Benny Green wrote and presented Gilbert and Sullivan, and also conversed with Dr Thomas Heric. The actors taking part were Frederick Treeves as Gilbert and Peter Welsh. Technical presentation for the series was by Basil Newman, and the producer was David Rayburn Allen. Well, next week at 9:30, we welcome back Nigel Ogden with more news, views and music from the organ world, both pipe and electronic. But now we shall welcome Joanne Watson with the sports news.
Good evening.